Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Early Kings of Norway by Thomas Carlyle. Chapter 5, Hakon Jarl.
Hakon Jarl, such the style he took, had engaged to pay some kind of tribute to King Bluetooth, if he could, but he never did pay any, pleading always the necessity of his own affairs, with which excuse, joined to Hakon's readiness in things less important, King Bluetooth managed to content himself, Hakon being always his good neighbor at least, and the two mutually dependent. In Norway, Hakon, without the title of king, did in a strong-handed, steadfast, and at length successful way the office of one, governed Norway, some count, for above 20 years, and both at home and abroad had much consideration through most of that time, especially amongst the heathen Orthodox, for Hakon Jarl himself was a zealous heathen, fixed in his mind against these chimerical Christian innovations and unsalutary changes of creed, and would have gladly trampled out all traces of what the last two kings, for GREYFELL also was an English Christian after his sort, had done in this respect. But he wisely discerned that it was not possible, and that, for peace's sake, he must not even attempt it, but must strike preferably into perfect toleration, and that of every one getting to heaven or even to the other goal in his own way. He himself, it is well known, repaired many heathen temples, a great church builder in his way, manufactured many splendid idols, with much gilding and such artistic ornament as there was, in particular, one huge image of Thor, not forgetting the hammer and appendages, and such a collar, supposed of solid gold, which it was not quite, as we shall hear in time, round the neck of him as was never seen in all the north. How he did his own Yule festivals, with what magnificent solemnity, the horse eatings, blood sprinklings, and other sacred rites need not be told. Something of a ritualist, one may perceive, perhaps had Scandinavian Puseyisms in him, and other desperate heathen notions. He was universally believed to have gone into magic, for one thing, and to have dangerous potencies derived from the devil himself. The dark heathen mind of him struggling vehemently in that strange element, not altogether so unlike our own in some points. For the rest, he was evidently, in practical matters, a man of sharp, clear insight, of steadfast resolution, diligence, promptitude, and managed his secular matters uncommonly well. Had 16 jarls under him, though himself only Hakon Jarl by title, and got obedience from them stricter than any king since Haarfagr had done. Add to which that the country had years excellent for grass and crop, and that the herrings came in exuberance, tokens to the thinking mind that Hakon Jarl was a favorite of heaven. His fight with the far-famed Vikings was his grandest exploit in public rumor. Jomsburg, a locality not now known, except that it was near the mouth of the river Oder, denoted in those ages the impregnable castle of a certain hotly corporate, or sea robbery association, limited, which, for some generations, held the Baltic in terror and plundered far beyond the belt, in the ocean itself, in Flanders and the opulent trading havens there, above all, in opulent anarchic England, which, for 40 years from about this time, was the pirates' Goshen, and yielded, regularly every summer, slaves, danegelt, and miscellaneous plunder, like no other country Jomsburg or the Viking world had ever known. Palnatoke, Boo, and the other quasi-heroic heads of this establishment are still remembered in the northern parts. Palnatoke is the title of a tragedy by Eulenschlager, which had its run of immortality in Copenhagen some 60 or 70 years ago. I judge the institution to have been in its floweriest state, probably now in Hakon Jarl's time. Hakon Jarl and these pirates, robbing Hakon's subjects and merchants that frequented him, were naturally in quarrel, and frequent fightings had fallen out, not generally to the profit of the Jomsburgers, who at last determined on revenge, and the rooting out of this obstructive Hakon Jarl. They assembled in force at the Cape of Stad, in the Firda Fylke, and the fight was dreadful in the extreme, noise of it filling all the north for long afterwards. Hakon, fighting like a lion, could scarcely hold his own. Death or victory, the word on both sides, when suddenly the heavens grew black, and there broke out a terrific storm of thunder and hail, appalling to the human mind, universe swallowed wholly in black night. Only the momentary forked blazes, the thunder pealing as of Ragnarok, and the battering hail torrents, hailstones about the size of an egg. Thor with his hammer evidently acting, but in behalf of whom? The Jomsburgers in the hideous darkness, broken only by flashing thunderbolts, had a dismal apprehension that it was probably not on their behalf, Thor having a sense of justice in him, and before the storm ended, 35 of their 70 ships sheered away, leaving gallant Bugh with the other 35 to follow as they liked, who reproachfully hailed these fugitives and continued the now hopeless battle. Bugh's nose and lips were smashed or cut away. Bugh managed half-articulately to exclaim, "Ha! The maids of Funen will never kiss me more! Overboard, all ye Bugh's men!" And taking his 2 sea chests with all the gold he had gained in such life struggle from of old, sprang overboard accordingly and finished the affair. Hakon Jarl's renown rose naturally to the transcendent pitch after this exploit. His people, I suppose chiefly the Christian part of them, whispered one to another with a shudder, that in the blackest of the thunderstorm he had taken his youngest little boy and made away with him, sacrificed him to Thor or some devil, and gained his victory by art magic or something worse. Jarl Erik, Hakon's eldest son, without suspicion of art magic, but already a distinguished Viking, became thrice distinguished by his style of sea fighting in this battle, and awakened great expectations in the Viking public. Of him we shall hear again. The Jomsburgers, one might fancy, after this sad clap went visibly down in the world, but the fact is not altogether so. Old King Bluetooth was now dead, died of a wound got in battle with his unnatural, so-called natural son and successor, Otto SVEIN of the Forked Beard, afterwards king and conqueror of England for a little while. And seldom, perhaps never, had Vikingism been in such flower as now. This man's name is Sven in Swedish, Svend in German, and means boy or lad, the English swain. It was at old Father Bluetooth's funeral ale, drunken burial feast, that Svein, carousing with his Jomsburg chiefs and other choice spirits, generally of the robber class, all risen into height of highest robber enthusiasm, pledged the vow to one another. Svein that he would conquer England, which in a sense he, after long struggling, did, and the Jomsburgers that they would ruin and root out Hakon Jarl, which, as we have just seen, they could by no means do, and other guests other foolish things which proved equally unfeasible. Sea robber volunteers so especially abounding in that time, one perceives how easily the Jomsburgers could recruit themselves, build or refit new robber fleets, man them with the pick of crews, and steer for opulent, fruitful England, where, under Ethelred the Unready, was such a field for profitable enterprise as the Viking public never had before or since. An idle question sometimes rises on me. Idle enough, for it never can be answered in the affirmative or the negative, whether it was not these same refitted Jomsburgers who appeared some while after this at Redhead Point on the shore of Angus, and sustained a new severe beating in what the Scotch still faintly remember as their Battle of Longcarty. Beyond doubt, a powerful Norse pirate armament dropped anchor at the Red Head, to the alarm of peaceable mortals about that time. It was thought and hoped to be on its way for England, but it visibly hung on for several days, deliberating, as was thought, whether they would do this poorer coast the honor to land on it before going farther. Did land, and vigorously plunder and burn southwestward as far as Perth, laid siege to Perth, but brought out King Kenneth on them, and produced that Battle of Longcarty, which still dwells in vague memory among the Scots. Perhaps it might be the Jomsburgers, perhaps also not, for there were many pirate associations, lasting not from century to century like the Jomsburgers, but only for very limited periods, or from year to year. Indeed, it was mainly by such that the splendid thief harvest of England was reaped in this disastrous time. No Scottish chronicler gives the least of exact date to their famed victory of Longcarty, only that it was achieved by Kenneth III, which will mean sometime between AD 975 and 994, and by the order they put it in, probably soon after AD 975, or the beginning of this Kenneth's reign. Buchanan's narrative, carefully distilled from all the ancient Scottish sources, is of admirable quality for style and otherwise quiet, brief, with perfect clearness, perfect credibility even, except that semi-miraculous appendage of the ploughman, Hay and Sons, always hanging to the tail of it, the grain of possible truth in which can now never be extracted by man's art. In brief, what we know is, fragments of ancient human bones and armor have occasionally been plowed up in this locality, proof positive of ancient fighting here, and the fight fell out not long after Hakon's beating of the Jomsburgers at the Cape of Stad. And in such dim glimmer of wavering twilight, the question whether these of Longcardy were refitted Jomsburgers or not must be left hanging. Longcardy is now the biggest bleach field in Queen Victoria's dominions. No village or hamlet there, only the huge bleaching house and a beautiful field, some 6 or 7 miles northwest of Perth, bordered by the beautiful Tay River on the one side and by its beautiful tributary Almond on the other. A Longcardy fitted either for bleaching linen or for a bit of fair duel between nations in those simple times. Whether our refitted Jomsburgers had the least thing to do with it is only matter of fancy, but if it were they who here again got a good beating, fancy would be glad to find herself fact. The old piratical kings of Denmark had been at the founding of Jomsburg, and to SVEIN of the Forked Beard it was still vitally important, but not so to the great Knut, or any king that followed, all of whom had better business than mere thieving. And it was Magnus the Good of Norway, a man of still higher anti-anarchic qualities, that annihilated it about a century later. Hakon Jarl, his chief labors in the world being over, is said to have become very dissolute in his elder days, especially in the matter of women. The wretched old fool, led away by idleness and fullness of bread, which to all of us are well said to be the parents of mischief. Having absolute power, he got into the habit of openly plundering men's pretty daughters and wives from them, and, after a few weeks, sending them back. Greatly to the rage of the fierce Norse heart, had there been any means of resisting or revenging. It did, after a little while, prove the ruin and destruction of Hakon the Rich, as he was then called. It opened the door, namely, for entry of Olaf Tryggveson upon the scene, a very much grander man, in regard to whom the wiles and traps of Hakon proved to be a recipe, not on Tryggveson, but on the wily Hakon himself, as shall now be seen straightway.
This concludes today's reading of Early Kings of Norway, by Thomas Carlyle. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.